Welcome to Module 5 presentation, a little bit about effective word choice. In this module, we've been talking about effective word choice and types of language to avoid, and also some positive things you can do to make effective word choices. I just want to say a few words about the types of language to avoid. Even though that's in our reading, we're just going to elaborate a little bit. Just to review, in the chapters we read about several types of language to avoid. The first one would be slang, or non-standard expressions specific to times or places. Cliché, which are expressions that have been so overused that they've worn out their meaning and they're no longer effective. And pretentious language, which is overly formalized or awkward phrasing that comes across as sounding confusing. These are the three in the book, and they're all very well delineated there. The new one that I want to talk about today is jargon, which the book does not really talk about. Jargon is another kind of language to avoid, and jargon by definition is special words or expressions that are used by particular professions or groups and so might be difficult for others to understand. Jargon is something that we encounter all the time in life. Anytime you are at the doctor and the doctor's giving a very clinical diagnosis of what is happening in your body and it's in words you can't understand, that's medical jargon. Or in watching sports commentary on TV or reading sports writing in the newspaper, often a person who doesn't closely follow a sport might not have any idea what's actually being said because of the jargon that's involved. Abbreviations, names for different rules and things like that. That's also jargon. And pretty much every profession has some level of jargon that's only known to people inside the profession. One that you might have run into in writing class is kind of grammatical jargon. Writing teachers throwing out grammar terms without explaining them or things like that. Jargon's a bad idea in a paper because it can alienate the reader. And avoiding all these types of language, slang, cliche, pretentious language, and jargon, avoiding all these does two things. First, it makes you credible in the eyes of the reader. Particularly using slang and cliche can diminish you in the eyes of the reader, in part because often readers will have some degree of prejudice against slang in formal academic writing. Most people are fine with slang in conversation or in casual writing, but when it comes to an essay or like a CV or cover letter, something for work or school, then generally people expect a more formal tone. So using slang could make you less credible in the eyes of the reader. And with cliche, writing that's full of cliches just tends to make you look unskilled as a writer, or as if you're just using the easiest expressions that come to mind. It doesn't make you seem very original, which could also make you less credible in the eyes of the reader. And avoiding these types of language also shows care for the reader by making things clear and understandable. This is particularly true with pretentious language and jargon. Filling a paper up with pretentious language can be alienating to the reader because it can have the effect of making the essay not very easy to understand or making it seem obscure. It can also create a tone that sounds like maybe you're lording it over the reader a little bit or trying to sound fancy, for lack of a better word. And jargon can be particularly alienating to a reader who doesn't understand that jargon because it makes that reader feel like an outsider. And so you want to try to avoid that. And the best way to avoid jargon is simply to, if you have to use specialized terms like that, to just define that term for the reader. That's the easiest way to avoid jargon. You don't even always have to get rid of all jargon from a paper, but just have to make sure to define terms that any reader might not know. And a great way to talk about effective word choice is to say, don't be a robot. And a lot of students don't realize that it is okay, and in fact it's desirable, to sound like a real person in an essay. While it's true that you should not write exactly how you would talk, because the way that you would normally talk probably includes things like slang and cliche that we already talked about, your writing should sound like you would normally say things, but just a little bit more formal. In other words, if you would never normally say something in a certain way, don't do it that way in a paper. There's no need to try to adopt a completely different style of phrasing than what you would use in normal life. Some students fall into this trap by trying to achieve an academic tone. They have this idea that there's this academic tone they need to strive for, and so can end up sounding awkward or robotic by doing things like using passive voice excessively, saying things like "it is evident that," or always having a passive voice verb construction instead of active voice verb construction. Another thing some students do is to run every other word through a thesaurus. So that, and this also then makes it sound very pretentious. This gets you into the pretentious language territory. An essay that's has had the thesaurus used extensively on it is always very obvious because the word choices seem forced or strange. If you're writing and you are using lots of words that you would never use in normal conversation because you're pulling those words from the thesaurus, chances are you might not be using all of those words correctly even, and it's going to make you sound strange. And then one last way students can kind of sound robotic is by avoiding any personal pronouns. And this is not always the fault of the student. Some students have been taught in high school to never use I or me or something like that. And so kind of learn to write with no personal pronouns. But the effect that has, particularly if you're writing papers like we are for this class that are more personal in nature, is it sounds extremely detached and off-putting to be writing about your own life with no personal pronouns. Kind of makes you sound like an academic robot. So all of this to say it's okay to sound like yourself, and you should have some concerns for formality and avoid things like slang, but it's definitely okay to write a sentence in the way that you would normally say it. And if you find that your essays sound completely different than any other writing you do outside of school or than the way that you speak, then you might be falling into this trap of academic robotic language. And it would be a good idea to try to get back to your own voice so that you can have a more authentic voice and tone in your paper.